I'm Steve Jakes, the Executive Director of the National Security Space Association. Glad to have you all joining on board. Brother Chris Williams, as soon as he can turn on his machine properly, will join the party. But thanks to all for being here to listen to this very important topic with General Kevin McLaughlin on space warfighting culture. I'm sure most of you know General McLaughlin, who he is, where he's been. He is a legacy space guy from the very beginning of time as he joined the Air Force years back, and had quite a diverse career throughout his Air Force career, culminating in his retirement as the Vice Commander of what is it? Cyber Command. I'm sorry. I was thinking Fort Meade, but certainly Cyber Command. But without any further ado, let us turn the microphone over to General McLaughlin. I think Chris Williams will be joining up here in just a moment. Glad to have you with us, Kevin. Thanks for your time, and the microphone is yours, my friend.
Steve, thanks very much. It's great to join all of you to talk about a topic that I think is very important and certainly near and dear to my heart. Chris had asked me just to talk a little bit about why we wrote the paper, and we've seen the discussion of the importance of culture, or whether that's an important thing or not, or what should it be. To be honest, going back a few decades, all the way back to prior to the Rumsfeld Commission, but certainly as we got to the early days of talking about a Space Corps and then the U.S. Space Force, it continued to be something that was very important. And so I've always focused on this, maybe even at times more so than other people thought was useful. And so I don't want to say it was a hobby horse of mine. I just said it was something I've always thought was very important. As we go through the discussion, I hope to explain to you a little bit about why. But what I was asked to do really is initially just kind of present the paper. It's been published. Many of you may have it already downloaded or have had a chance to scan it. But with your indulgence, we're going to take a little while, and I'm just going to run through sort of an oral presentation of the paper itself. And then we're going to go into Q&As. I think there'll be ways for each of you to ask questions if you're online, and Chris will moderate those questions as he can once he gets in, and I also have a chance to see the questions as they're put in. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. As you guys might have seen, the way I try to tee up the topic in general was really starting with the need to have a U.S. Space Force and some of the key things associated with having a service that really is governed by different physical laws and principles from the services that focus on the other domains. That happened back in December of last year. We're coming up on the first anniversary of that. But since that time, since General Raymond was named the Chief of Space Operations and we created the separate service, they've been moving in a sprint to create and stand up this new military service. My hat's off, and I applaud the work that they've been doing. But they are doing a great job. But it seems like every day or every week we read about something new that's come out of their work, and I applaud what they've been doing. And so this paper is meant to help that. It's not meant to criticize or second guess at all. It is meant to be something that would be useful to thinking about as we create this new service that's dedicated solely to the missions assigned to it by our civilian military leaders, that we would create sort of a fabric of a culture of the people, I've called them space warfighters in this paper, and the space warfighting culture that goes along with it. I realize that could be viewed as problematic for some just because of the terminology, but at the end of the day, we need a force that's filled with people that from beginning to end are familiar with and can influence the development of the systems and doctrine and operations that not only can do the missions assigned to them today, but more importantly, those that will come in the future that we perhaps don't see clearly today. As I thought about this issue, I kind of began to think about what are some of the cornerstones of the work to this point. And certainly, I think one of the most important ones was in August of this year when the Space Force published its space capstone publication. So its initial strategic doctrine called Space Power: A Doctrine for Space Forces. I think that provided a lot in terms of initial ethos and values for the Space Force. But I think the next major challenge and the focus of the paper was the development of the culture that would actually exist in order to deliver upon the doctrine and deliver upon all the challenges assigned to the Space Force. As some of you may know and others might not, today we don't really have a warfighting culture in the space community. I grew up in that community. That's not meant as a slam or a criticism. It's just a statement that we created the Air Force legacy space capabilities and the people that operate in it, largely in the mode of or thinking especially over sort of the last 2 decades or so, that these wonderful machines that we operated could do so in a domain that was not necessarily contested by the adversary or by any adversary, and the people that make up that culture in general are more of sort of a service provider supporting type of legacy than a warfighting culture. I will make a few comments a little bit later that I think this notion of a space as a contested or warfighting domain, while we may use that lexicon today, it's not a new thing. And we probably had a more focused space warfighting culture back in the 70s and the 80s, in my early days as an officer, than we've had in this intervening period. And I'll describe what I mean by that in a little bit. Well, in order to get at this and make a contribution, what I really decided to do was to step back and think, what are some of the fundamental questions that have been out there that we've been asking? And I think there are 3 of them. One is, what is a space warfighting culture? And most of this paper gets into the way that I sort of broke down and then built back up what I thought would be the core attributes of a space warfighting culture, and they're in 3 separate bins that we'll talk about. I also, though, the question is, why is it important? Why should we spend this time? Why are we talking about this today? And I think so. I spent some time on why I thought it was important. But then again, how does the U.S. Space Force create such a culture? And I need to say, first of all, this is not written from the perspective that the U.S. Space Force is just waiting for us to publish this paper so they can get direction and guidance. That is not the context of this at all. They're off busily working on, I think, creating a culture that's unique to them. But I do have some thoughts about things that maybe should be paid attention to or prioritized as that new culture is actually created. You can read the paper a little bit about my background. All I would really say, and we might get into this in the Q&As, my background, as Steve mentioned, has been unique. And luckily, I wasn't in charge of deciding what I did as an Air Force officer, but the opportunities I had were awesome. And they allowed me not only to be sort of deeply experienced as a young officer in space operations in the areas that I worked, which were space control and launch and satellite command and control, but I also had the chance to begin to focus on how are these capabilities, how are they used and integrated into warfighting, not just on the space side, but also in other domains, and really culminating with a couple of assignments in the cyber area, where the challenges, while cyber is different than space, the challenges of creating a warfighting culture were very much, I had a lot in common with the space side. I've sort of taken a very technically oriented, functional set of processes within the DoD and turning them into a very technical, but a set of warfighting processes and focuses, including on the culture side. And so that's sort of been the background that I've had broadly. You can certainly look at my bio and see some of the exact assignments that I've had. But I would say what I've tried to do is to take away those things that are useful, beneficial, that are great attributes from other communities, and look to see how they might be applied to the community that I'm in, whether it's the space community, the cyber community. I don't think you should stand up something new in the absence of knowing those things that exist that are useful or would be helpful, and then knowing what things are different that you need to define and stand up for and fight for. And so I took good away from most of my assignments, but I also have become more emphatic of the things that are unique in the domains of space warfare or cyber warfare that I think are worthy of discussing. So what is a space warfighting culture? I took a little bit of time, and you can see it in the paper just to define broadly what culture is. There's a million definitions. There's a million things written about culture and its importance to large organizations. But in a nutshell, these are the attributes that make up a culture that give an organization a shared set of values, a collection of shared knowledge, shared behaviors that derive from experiences within the group, and a collective identity that distinguishes the members of this culture from another. And so those are important in business, they're important in all kinds of organizations, but they're absolutely important to military services, and there are some unique things about the cultures within military services. And so as I thought about translating this to specifically a space warfighting culture, the more I read and studied about it over the years, I've thought that there really are groupings in 3 areas of attributes that we ought to consider for a space warfighting culture. And I went pretty deep in the paper on these. I'll just scan some of the key parts as I present the paper orally. But those 3 subsets are the culture in a military service at the first order ought to reflect the enduring nature of war and apply and how these apply to any warfighting culture in any domain. And I'll talk about what I mean by that when I get to that section of the paper. Secondly, our culture in the space warfighting arena needs to reflect the uniqueness of warfare in the space domain, and that domain that is uniquely assigned to the U.S. Space Force. And there's a lot of great meat on this aspect of the uniqueness of warfare in this domain in the Space Capstone Doctrine document. And then third, and I think this is the most interesting and perhaps the greatest opportunities for the Space Force, but that's creating a culture that reflects the ever-changing character of war, that aspect of war that actually does change, and I'll describe what I mean by that over time, due to lots of factors such as technology, political structures, et cetera. But these offer these rapidly changing character of wars that have existed in the past, but I think they're happening more in a more compressed and more complex way today. They offer really strategic opportunities for all the military services, but certainly to the new U.S. Space Force. So let's get into it. As we talk about these 3 sets of attributes in more detail, I would say that, in my opinion, these attributes or attributes very close to them ought to be taught to and reinforced with members of the U.S. Space Force, uniformed and civilian, from the very first day that they sign into or accepted into this organization, so that the values and the knowledge, behaviors, and ways of thinking that make up this culture will be able to forge a collective and individual identities of the people in this new service. And it doesn't matter whether it's at the lowest organizational element to these field commands that are commanded by 2- and 3-star generals, all the way up to the service headquarters in the Pentagon. The entire fabric needs to adhere to these values and the behaviors and ways of thinking. And during this critical period, in the early days, the Space Force should really focus on deliberately working to set this new culture. And I would recommend along the 3 sets of principles that we're going to talk about. So let's get into the first one. The first is the space warfighting culture must be mindful of and reflect the enduring nature of war. I've defined that. I actually took it from an author, which is footnoted in the paper. But the nature of war describes warfare's unchanging essence. That is, those things that differentiate war as a type of phenomenon from other things. War's nature is violent, interactive, and fundamentally political. Absent any of these elements, what you were talking about is not war, but something else. That's what this is, because this is a military service. If we would have created perhaps an agency or some other entity that was not a military service, it would likely have a very need for a very different type of culture. But the U.S. Space Force is a military service, and the enduring nature of war needs to be inculcated into the culture of all the people that are in this service. I've listed a number of subsets that ought to be part of this. I'm not going to go through all of them just in the interest of time, but I will maybe touch on just a few of these. First, the people in the Space Force need to know that they're, from the way we set our initial values and reason for existing, is on the primary task of defending the country by winning our nation's wars in the space domain. That doesn't mean every war is going to be won solely in the space domain. It means the U.S. Space Force and its units, and when we get into joint operations, their unique contributions to winning the war will be in the space domain. And there's a difference between being responsible for winning and executing tasks directly associated with winning versus supporting other entities or other services that are responsible for winning. And I think that is a delineation that will make a difference in this new service. I think it's worthy of stating that I grew up in an era where most of what we did in the middle part of my career was focused on providing great space support. You know, I launched Titan IV rockets. I commanded the Global Positioning System Squadron and later the operations group for many of the DoD satellites. And so supporting other joint users and other operators is an honorable thing to do, and it's critical. But to be honest, Air Force Space Command, prior to the U.S. Space Force, was doing that. I think the core reason for existing in this new service, while support to joint operations is a stated responsibility, I do think the primary task is defending the country by winning our wars. And I do think that we should be careful to make sure that we don't get confused about what the primary reason for being is. I think as an airman when I was an Air Force officer, it was similar to winning the wars associated with air superiority or conducting air combat. Didn't mean that we didn't do close air support. It didn't mean we didn't do airlift operations or global mobility. They were all important missions, but at the end of the day, the reason the service existed wasn't to do the support functions solely, it was to do their primary warfighting mission. I think another thing that is important in this enduring nature of war is that it is a competitive environment. The people that are in this environment and in this enduring nature of war, as it applies to the other services, the entire cultures are ones of competition, continually training, focusing on not on a sort of an inward focus of making a machine work or sort of inwardly trying to figure out what's happening, but it was an outward focus, delivering an outcome against an adversary, and an adversary that is trying to defeat you. And so that process, that continual part of the culture, is always training, competing, and being evaluated and assessing your ability to do that. And to do that kind of through the spectrum, whether it's individual training up to large force exercises. And so I do think that enduring nature of war, and I'm going to reemphasize it again, does require a culture that's outwardly focused on adversary and threat versus what I grew up primarily as a space officer in the Air Force. I was more internally focused on the successful and competent operating of the platforms that we had, which is important and a necessary task. But that inward focus was really not, didn't have an outward focus on the adversary. It had the inward focus on making cool machines like the Global Positioning System is some of the coolest, making them work well and efficiently. And really two different sets of mindsets that come from the legacy culture versus the one that we should create. I do think it's important that we understand that all warfighting personnel in all services, including the new U.S. Space Force, if you're going to be a practitioner of warfare in any domain, you must be highly expert in all the aspects of the weapons platforms and formations and how they maneuver. but you realize these are part of not the end, but an end state of actually applying all of that in the execution of the mission. And then I would just say, as we finish, well, there's, you know, I understand there's lots of people that the jokes about a U.S. Space Force and others have been out there since we began to talk about it. And even as a space officer growing up, I found myself with, you know, other warfighters, and, you know, there's always sort of a question about, you know, are you really part of this team? And I think it's worthy of talking about the fact that people in the U.S. Space Force, people in all the military, need to be anchored on the fact that it may be necessary to risk or sacrifice your life in the defense of the country. And many people may think, well, space people stay in the pristine and antiseptic operations centers in the center of our country. Well, the reality is that's not where they all operate from. They operate all over the world, often in forward deployed environments. And the adversaries we have today have the ability to use long-range precision weapons capable of striking targets that we may view as sanctuary, either in allied countries or even in our own country. And so warfare and the character of war is changing, and the people involved in the U.S. Space Force need to have the same ethos as being willing to risk or sacrifice their life as anybody else. So what I'd like to do is to move into the second set of attributes, and that's the warfighting culture must reflect the uniqueness of warfare in the space domain. And as I mentioned, the Space Capstone publication did a great job of sort of framing some of those unique natures. They talk, and I've included them in the paper, but they do talk about an initial set of sort of values, knowledge, and behaviors that are tied to the domain itself. My view is not to really try to recreate what's in that great document, but just to reemphasize, I think, right alongside the U.S. Space Force, that these specific and highly technical attributes need to be defined and taught to all members of the Space Force in great technical detail. Whether it's the challenges and attributes of spaceflight and maneuver in Earth orbit, and how that differs from flight and maneuver in the air or maneuver in other domains, but all the fundamentals that go into operating in the space domain. There are very unique aspects in the theory, policy, and legal side of space power. Some that are common to other domains of warfare, and some that are unique, such as definition of sovereignty of a particular country is different if you step on their soil or sail a ship into their territorial waters or fly an airplane over their territory, but it's not the same if a satellite flies over it. So there just are differences. Those differences need to be understood and taken advantage of. The U.S. Space Force is defining core tenets of military space power. They do take the first steps in their capstone document. And these tenets in the notion of military space power, both intellectually and in practice, need to be taught throughout the U.S. Space Force, throughout its people, its new people, and its existing folks, to make sure they all understand the value that military space power brings broadly to defending the country, to ensuring our security and winning our wars when necessary. So the second area of attributes really is in these areas that are unique to the space domain. The last set of attributes, and again, I think the first two are very important, but this one to me is most fascinating, and that is how do we create a space warfighting culture that is connected to the ever-changing character of war? So unlike the nature of war, which remains the same, the character of war really talks about how war as a phenomena changes over time, and it manifests itself in different types of operations over time, where it's influenced by things like changing technology, changing law, ethics, culture, different methods of organization, whether it's military, socially, or politically. These things change across time and space, and throughout our history, they've changed the character of war. I would argue those changes are happening breathtaking pace, and they're happening in ways that are very complex. And so the issue for the U.S. Space Force as a new service is, can you create a culture that embraces this change and is continually looking at how it needs to adjust, make changes based on technologies, how it needs to really thinking critically about them, challenging paradigms, even paradigms that maybe have only existed for months, not paradigms that existed for decades. And so I think this is an area of great opportunity for the U.S. Space Force. I've listed a few of the things that I think are important because I think these are the hardest thing for a bureaucracy to deal with. The U.S. Space Force will have a bureaucracy. Every organization does. I have a one-person consulting company, and I have a bureaucracy. That's me. And so it's not a cuss word. The issue is, can you have your culture within your bureaucracy set to actually weave new futures out of in the midst of all of this change, and that the people involved are comfortable with change, risk taking, and innovation. So I listed a few of the technical things that are happening. By the way, they exist everywhere. Leveraging big data, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. Every service is having to do this, but I do think these technologies are driving many changes in the character of war. And some of these areas, space people are really comfortable with. The advent of autonomous systems with humans in some of the loops, perhaps not all of them. Those are on the horizon, and our warfighting culture in the U.S. Space Force will need to be able to adopt these new technologies, but think of ways to defeat future adversaries using the same. We are already on the verge of having remote-controlled, very long-range weapons, both kinetic weapons as well as non-kinetic weapons that could be delivered through space or cyber or other areas. And so this is changing in many ways the character of war. I think our space warfighting culture is perfectly suited to be both expert and comfortable in this area of changes. Some that are a little bit more difficult, I don't think the U.S. Space Force will not be comfortable with these, but I haven't really seen them laid out in the way that I'm laying them out, and that is these technologies allow us to uniquely mass combat power, technology, and human talent against complex global problems, whether they're a problem that exists in a theater or exist in a broader strategic sense in the space domain. And so, but you actually have to create a culture and define teams that are actually at the very beginning comprised of all the experts that are there, that are, in my time as a space operator, to be honest, we had a culture that the space operator, which might be, 0.5%, very small number of the people in the overall enterprise, were kind of the focus. We wore the cool uniforms and we kind of acted like the world revolved around us. And the reality is, with these new technologies, you can actually build teams that have many more sets of experts and many more disciplines, and totally change the paradigm of who the core players are, because they're numerous. And that's kind of how I think about massing both combat power, technology, and human talent, and describe that in some detail in the paper. I had a section where I talked about the modern definition of a warfighter. And again, I could use my subculture in the old days of the space operations culture, but I could go to, a fighter pilot culture in the Air Force, or the infantry ground combat culture in the Army, you name it. All the services have sort of subcultures that I would say significantly shape the broader service intellectual approaches regarding the service strategy and how it writes its requirements and develops concepts of operations. I don't think that's a bad thing in and of itself, but if it's left unchecked, these subcultures can morph into sort of separate classes within a service, in which warfare operations cultures can be, in my opinion, can become too narrowly defined, and then they're not keeping pace with the changing character of war. They hinder the introduction of new ideas and stifle critical thinking if not paid close attention to. And so I believe the U.S. Space Force has the opportunity to create a culture that's based on the expectation that due to the rapidly changing character of war, the real premium is on critical thinking, having members that continually challenge existing dogma, that champion strategic and tactical innovation, and that embrace the fact that we will have not just operators, but personnel with broad sets of backgrounds, intel officers, technologists, strategists, cyber officers, you name it, that are all part of a team, and it's wielding that team and having all of those be part of this broader warfighting culture in the space community. If they're wired to think that way, I think you could really unleash something that we haven't seen in terms of effectiveness towards future challenges. And so I think the ever-changing character of war is something that is the set of opportunities that we have for the U.S. Space Force. I do think we have the opportunity to more broadly define those that can make significant contributions to the actual overall mission. And so I think the power of multidisciplinary teams across the spectrum of the service is important. And if we define that and embrace it, we actually have the ability for all members of the Space Force, whether they're wearing the uniform or not, to feel like they're part of an organization with this shared sense of values and a shared sense of purpose. I do think one thing that I've put it in this category of changing character of war, but maybe this is on the technology side that's driving this, but I believe we have the opportunity to better connect the space operations with the space research and development and acquisition communities. Even back in the paper, you'll see in 2001, I wrote a paragraph in as a member of the Rumsfeld Space Commission. I wrote a staff background paper on military space culture back 20 years ago, and made the argument that space, unlike really any other domain, although in later years I began to think cyber might be in the same area, that it does benefit from a unique and close relationship between research, development, acquisition, and operations. The Space Commission recommended some changes to drive that relationship more closely than it was at the time. It also looked at making similar drives to ensure the Air Force and the NRO, kind of what black and white space, were integrated tightly. But we didn't really make the progress towards that. Now we have the U.S. Space Force. We're still waiting to see the shape of the new Space Systems Command, the field command that will be the new command for space development and acquisition. And I believe we have an opportunity today, based on the changing character of war, to not only create this new command in a way that brings in and really focuses on attributes that we're looking for, that General Raymond is saying that he thinks are really important, so that we really look at risk-taking, speed, innovation, but we also have a very tightly coupled connection between the operational part of the space culture and the development and acquisition side. And so we have the chance to build that bond now, and I would recommend that it be a high priority for the Space Force. Again, it likely is, but I think it's worthy of saying. And so I think just based on time, I'm not going to say anything else about that except one last point, and that is, there's a lot of discussion that has been, what's the real purpose of the Space Force? Over time you'll say, does it look up or does it look down? Is it about support or is it about space warfare? Is it about war fighting or is it about security and presence? Is it more like the Navy or is it more like the Air Force? I really think those are interesting questions, but what I really think is important is that we build a culture that as time marches forward and the character of war continues to evolve, and the nation's leadership continue to ask different or new things from its military, including the Space Force, that our culture needs to be ready for this broader expression of our future strategic interest in the space domain. These could extend to the moon. They could extend in somewhere in our solar system. It could begin to be focused more and more on science and human exploration, economic and business interest, et cetera. It is possible that in this future, the U.S. Space Force will be called on to provide presence and security for our interest as our focus expands outward. While today our focus it's very complicated, but our focus is probably today more on defending and securing our current space assets in Earth orbit, and if needed, to deny the adversary's use of that domain at the same time. And so I just wanted to comment that if we build the right culture, we will be able to adjust and succeed and lead turn problems as they come in the future. Those may not be that far away, but at those that are, thinking about these broader strategies that tie kind of like Alfred Thayer Mahan did, and for naval power, I think growing thinkers and strategists that are comfortable and able to compete in the war of ideas in that area are part of this last set of the culture that we want to build. In terms of why it's important, I'll just say it's vitally important in every organization, and maybe just to cut to the chase on why it's important. I believe a lot of the arguments that were against a Space Force were, you would hear them say that it's just a rearranging of deck chairs. And to me, just to summarize why it's important, creating a culture that has the attributes that I described and creates a culture made up of people that think about this organization differently than in the past. That's the difference between a rearranging of deck chairs versus a transformative organization that is going to be a very powerful force, for our country, whether it's in keeping the peace or if needed to be winning our wars. And I think that's, just to cut to the chase, I think that's the reason the culture side of this is so important. I do make some comments that a difficulty in any building of a new culture is if you're building it on top of an old legacy culture versus starting with a clean sheet of paper. And the reality is the U.S. Space Force is having to build its new culture on top of the old one that has existed for a long time. And I make the point in the paper that that's the culture I was tied to for much of my 34-year military career. I think that culture helped win the Cold War and brought the marvels of military space capabilities like GPS and others. It's a proud culture. I'm proud to have been part of it, and I would not denigrate it. But it's not the culture we need today or in the future for the U.S. Space Force. And it's a space in support of other activities is the culture associated with that. And it's primarily one that's focused on operating platforms that support operations in other domains and that do so in a benign environment. And so the challenge is laid for the Space Force today, both by the leadership of the country and from the Congress, is to create a different entity that's able to ensure security, deter our adversaries, and win wars in that domain if required. And I kind of end that section by saying, I believe the true advantage isn't a Space Force that creates the coolest new space systems, exotic space weapons, or brilliant new concepts of operations. The true advantage is going to be the development of a warfighting culture that drives a unified approach to every aspect of how this new service thinks, functions, operates, and fights. That will let the people in this organization, this new service, shoulder a much heavier burden than their predecessors, the ones are in the burdens that I had to carry as a space officer in the Air Force. And at the end of the day, it allows them to do what the nation asks. Military services don't invent their missions. They don't invent the things that they do operationally. They respond to things that the leadership of the country asks them to do, and those things change. And so the goal is being ready to anticipate and to be successful at that versus believe the world will always exist the way that it existed yesterday or the day before. I have a number of items about how to create it, and I'll just say primarily the leadership of the Space Force needs to first to define the culture. They are well along the ways of doing that with documents like the new capstone doctrine document, and as well as General Raymond's new planning guidance that he issued after this paper was published. But I think many of the elements are also covered in this paper, and would hope that they would be given careful consideration. But at the end of the day, I think they should be established up front. There should be clear expectation that people, especially mid and senior leaders, adhere to the values and that they lead in ways that don't create a dissonance between the stated purpose and values and the actual culture. The more those get separated, you create all kinds of reputational problems externally and with the people that are in there. So consistency among the leaders is critical. If there are people from the old Air Force space culture that really struggle with or have the tools needed to make the transition to this new culture, I saw this at U.S. Cyber Command as we were transitioning from sort of an IT focused culture to a warfare focused culture. And our challenge as senior leaders was to try to bring those great people that had been part of the old legacy culture into this new culture and let them, so they could be productive. But there were some who couldn't do it for a variety of reasons, not large numbers, but we had to find them, and then we had to find ways for them to go to serve in other areas, because if not everyone is on the same sheet of music, especially at the mid-senior leader level, it can really create significant problems in creation of a new culture. So I want to give time for some questions. I don't know if Chris has been able to make it in to this. If you have questions on U.S. Space Force and U.S. Space Command, as I wrote this and asked for peer review, a lot of questions came up. I do have a section kind of on space warfighting culture in the Space Force and U.S. Space Command on how I see the roles and which organizations have the most influence on space culture. And by the way, I believe it's the service components, not the combatant commands, but all of them have a role to play. And then last, just in summary, I'll just say, I think for the Space Force, the creation of this new culture is, to me, the most important thing that will ensure that we have an enduring joint warfighter ethos, and that we're able to deal with the rapidly changing character of war and be relevant and a significant force as things change and as we move forward. So I'll stop with what we have, and then I'll see if we've been able to get Chris in. Oh, I see Chris. I see your face on there, so I'm sorry to drone on as long as I did, but I'm glad you're there, and I'll stop the presentation of the paper and turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. We're deeply honored that you would join us today, and really appreciate the hard work that went into producing this valuable paper. I've said before, and will repeat now, that I think it's absolutely must reading for all members of the Space Force and others across the department and across the interagency. And I suspect even many of our adversaries and allies and others will be taking a close look at this paper and appreciating the important thoughts that are contained therein. So thank you for doing it. Really appreciate it. My apologies for joining late. I had some technical difficulties in getting on here this morning, but I heard most of what you said, and again have carefully read the paper and find it a tremendous contribution to the debate on this issue, dialogue on this issue. So well done, Kevin. We do have a few questions we'd like to pose to you. And we will be taking some of the questions that are coming in from our audience today. Let me start with the following, Kevin. You have a rich and highly varied military background. Can you tell us a little bit about your career and some of the lessons that you've drawn from your experience that influenced this paper? You've touched on some of them, but I wanted to give you a broader opportunity to comment on some of the lessons of your career how it affects your thoughts on warfighting, the need for a warfighting culture in the Space Force.
Sure. I appreciate the question. I know, again, that my friends who've known me a long time might think I've been a little bit twisted in this area, but I've thought about this. And as my career kind of moved forward, um, my experiences shaped how I thought about culture, and it never really changed my mind about it. I just think my views deepened and broadened. I think if I were to kind of think about that, Chris, I would just say, I kind of think of in 34 years, that I kind of had epics of experiences. And my early ones I started in 1983, kind of up to the end of the Cold War. I was a junior officer. We were actually thinking a lot about space warfare. I do kind of chuckle when I hear people talk about, we're just now talking about space as a domain of warfare, and a lot of these activities are just beginning to be thought about. I would just say we're starting to think about them again. But when I was a chief satellite officer in the Space Defense Operations Center, and our whole job was focusing on space warfare and to helping defend U.S. assets from Soviet ASAT and other types of attacks. Mm-hmm. And so in that epoch, what I was focusing on was defending our space assets initially and thinking about warfare in the domain. The Soviet Union, just in one area in co-orbital kinetic kill ASAT, they tested many times successfully, that 20 times.
A lot of people have forgotten that. Yep.
We actually launched an air-launched ASAT off of an F-15 and successfully intercepted a satellite in low Earth orbit in 1985. I actually was on crew that night in the SPADOC when we did that. And so, and those were all have all been, talked about openly. I would say there was a different worry about security, but I was looking back through this document here, Space Handbook. This is something we published, we had back in those timeframes, and it covered a lot of that. But to be honest, that focus after about 1990 kind of went away. The Soviet Union fell, and the space enterprise was still focused on supporting strategic users and national leadership inside the Beltway. Direct support to tactical and operational warfighters, which is commonplace today, was not a thing. And so that was sort of my first epic. And I wasn't thinking about culture as much as I was immersed in a culture. During that period of time, I was assigned to the NRO for an assignment back when it was still a covert organization. I launched, classified and other satellites on Titan IVs, and worked in sort of I'd say learning and honing my vertical depth in space mission areas. The second epoch, though, from 1990 sort of to 2000, now we're in the post-Desert Storm epoch. General Chuck Horner became the Air Force Space Command commander after leading air operations in Desert Storm, very focused on helping make the transition to using all these cool assets to helping tactical warfighters, not just in the Air Force, but in others, a really good transition. We integrated the ICBM force into Air Force Space Command, which I think brought some great rigor, but it also had some unintended consequences. And we really began to try to operationalize space. There was, I think, we misapplied much of that, and I saw some ill effects and the culture that we built from inside the trenches of in my space operation assignments during this period. And this is where I was, as I mentioned, was command and controlling GPS satellites. I led the initial operationally responsive space office. And I began to see that we'd sort of lost our focus on many of the things that made up the culture in the early days. And many of the leaders, above me and even my peers began to sort of merge and blend into various space jobs where people didn't really have the backgrounds, technical backgrounds that we had in the past. People didn't really have necessarily much depth in specific areas, and I began to feel like there's some things that aren't that healthy about where this epoch of time. I didn't know that I called it culture, but I began to kind of question what were we doing, and was it going to be useful in getting the mission done? After that, I moved into the 2010. That's kind of the Space Commission timeframe. Was just completing, and I began to broaden myself outside of space assignments, not through because I chose to, but the Air Force did. But they were great opportunities because I began to see the challenges in our space culture in a more fundamental way. But I also had experiences such as like the vice commander at the Air Force Warfare Center, being deep dipped into the Air Force fighter community, working on the space culture paper for the Space Commission. But I began to see other cultures and real data that showed how they grew their people, how they established their culture, and how important they were to their warfighting cultures. And we began to think a lot more seriously about what are some of the things that I'm learning. And I learned three things in that area, especially coming out of the Space Commission. One is bureaucracies will fight hard to protect themselves if you're suggesting significant changes. Second, senior leaders are responsible for executing strategic change, but they have to actually pay attention to what's going on. I call it under the hood of the organization. And then last, they often actually have to have pretty strong moral courage to stand up and tell others in their tribe, no, we're going to make these changes. And that's not always easy to do. And if you are not successful in those areas, you can actually begin to lose credibility with your people or with others where they see examples of where the culture itself does not match stated values. So that's that. And then the last thing I would say where my perspective changed was just the last part of my career as a more senior officer. I really would say in the cyber area and being asked to lead the stand up of the cyber operationalization of the Air Force cyber component. I wasn't the first commander there. We had great leaders before me, but we were creating the cyber mission force and beginning to operationalize that. And then to my surprise, I was promoted again and spent 3 years as the deputy at U.S. Cyber Command. And what I learned there was how a culture can be both reflective of the enduring nature of war, things that are changing very, very rapidly, take advantage of the uniqueness of warfare in a new novel domain, and how they create strategic opportunities for the country when you build a culture that can take advantage of that. Despite having bureaucratic struggles and frictions between combatant commands, between space and cyber communities, between functional communities, and even between the services, what I saw and what always heartened me was that when we focused on a national or joint outcome, like defeating ISIS, it drove totally new ways of planning and executing complex multi-domain operations where our area of cyber could be strategically important. So those are just examples of things that I experienced during my career that evolved and changed how I think about culture and why it's so important.
That's great. Thanks, Kevin. Let me shift to education and training. How important is education for inculcating an appropriate culture within the Space Force? And to what extent is culture taught in professional military education today? Are you familiar with the curriculum for PME on space warfighting related matters, and how does that shape up in your mind? And then a corollary question is more or less the same for training. Is culture taught and reinforced in training today, training of the Space Force today, and how can training events and opportunities be strengthened? So would you address the education and training aspect of this as well, and as part of a broader effort to inculcate an appropriate culture within the Space Force?
Sure. I think I would say, in my opinion, I don't think culture actually needs to be taught as a specific subject. Like today's the block of instruction on culture. Mm-hmm. I think it's really an amalgamation of everything that's taught, from basic training through professional military education and in day-to-day mission execution. I think about my time the first day at the Air Force Academy. I learned from day one and all the way through the academy and in the early, throughout my early stages of the Air Force. The mission of the Air Force was to fly, fight, and win, and don't you ever forget it. I learned about air power and great airmen in history, not just at PME, but I learned about them as something that was just part of the fabric of our existence, including PME. As I became more senior, I attended, PME schools as a lieutenant and a major and a colonel, and I continue to be inculcated into that broader warfighting culture, but at more senior levels. And so I think that's what the Space Force needs to do, is to make sure not only in PME and at that part of education, but throughout the fabric of what happens from the first day through those day-to-day things that happen in the service. That's where I think the culture is taught and inculcated. I'm not aware of exactly what the curriculum looks like today at Air War College. I'm not even aware of what the strategic long-term plan. I know General Raymond and the Air Force leadership and people on this call today might know what the plan is to change and adapt and have more robust Space Force blocks of instruction. I did see the first group of trainees at basic training just started. The senior chief, the chief master sergeant of the Space Force, that was down there for that. But I do think it's not a single thing to be taught. It's a day-to-day thing. On the training side, it's a similar issue, but on the training piece, I do think, as I mentioned in the paper, that on the training side, the way to inculcate and establish this strong warfighting culture is to ensure we routinely operate in stressed combat simulated environments against capable thinking adversaries. And so we're not at war today in the space domain, I think, in the way we could be in the future, which is great. I'm glad we're not. But we could still, the Space Force needs to create the platform and the rhythm for its personnel units to routinely train and compete in these virtual environments, so that they're not doing what I used to do, which is I was just trained and evaluated to make sure, do I know how to operate the GPS system and work through anomalies and know what to do to keep it operating to a high degree. That's different than continually training against someone who's trying to attack you or defeat you. And so I think education and training are kind of two sides of the same coin. I think of them as continual processes across the life cycle of a person in the Space Force. And that's how I think they begin to impact culture.
Thanks. The Space Force plans to leverage military professionals from the Air Force and other services, as well as a broad range of talented and tech-savvy civilians. How does one instill a common space warfighting culture among such a diverse group of individuals? You touched on this in the paper and in your comments about the importance of teams and a variety of capabilities that different elements of teams bring. But do you want to talk about that a little bit? The diverse nature of the Space Force across the profession?
Sure. Well, I do think it's maybe just continuing on the theme of what we've discussed. I do think as the Space Force has the ability to actually build the actual training and education fabric that would exist, I think that needs to not only be provided and taught to all the existing members, but whether you're a new space person that's coming in as an enlisted person, or a new officer being commissioned, or a new civil servant being brought into this, I guess the plan today is they'll be Department of the Air Force administratively, but Space Force assigned, as well as members that might come over from the other services. But as you make that transition, then I think you should begin to be trained and educated and inculcated broadly into this culture. And as I mentioned before, one of the attributes of the culture is that we ought to redefine who the people are that actually accomplish the mission, whether it's broad sets of multidisciplinary team members in a distributed space operation, or it's the operators in the development and acquisition professionals in the Space Force that are yet part of a different type of team, all oriented on this broader shared sense of values and mission. I think that, that sounds easy to say. It's actually not even easy to say, but it's really hard to do. But that's what I think the Space Force should create. You can't create it, if today's a Monday or Tuesday, you can't create it, tomorrow. But if that's the guide star of what you're marching towards, and you begin to build it, and you're putting another brick in the wall every day, almost like what we see coming out of the Space Force, I think you begin to create this diverse set of uniformed and non-uniformed civilians that really have a common view of why they exist, what they do, what's unique about it. And I think it keeps even though the Space Force will be smaller than the other services, it's still going to be tens of thousands of people. And you want to keep all of them in harmony towards a single set of goals and objectives. So that's what I think would be important to do. And I think it's within the reach of the Space Force to do exactly that.
Thanks. Given your background and experience, including your service at the National Reconnaissance Office, I'd like to ask you about DoD-IC integration, especially as it relates to national security space. Kevin, what's your view on how much progress has been made in this area already and what work remains? And how would you compare the cultures of the NRO and the Space Force?
Well, Chris, I know you personally and a lot of people on this call have probably been part of Air Force or DoD and IC integration activities over the years. And to be honest, it's ebbed and flowed. When I was a young officer in the NRO and the organization didn't exist in the public, I think the DoD integration in the NRO was effective. It was clearly stated what parts of the DoD were actually components to the NRO. We had career paths about how people flowed through both their service career pyramids and how they touch and connected into the NRO. Really wasn't much discussion of DoD taking over the NRO, and I thought it was a pretty effective way that we integrated. But as time moved on, and as Air Force Space Command stood up and matured, and as we got into the Rumsfeld Space Commission, there began to be more discussion about more fundamental integration, and the discussion took many forms, but it was sort of not stated often was, should the NRO kind of not really be integrated but moved into DoD. I think the Rumsfeld Space Commission sort of thought that was kind of the path perhaps we ought to be on, at least for operation and acquisition of both DoD and NRO systems. Over in the years since that, and really because of scar tissue from even other areas, I think my view on DoD IC integration would be I would probably tend to stay away from anything where it would appear as if DoD would sort of suck in the NRO or an IC organization that has a totally different statutory set of authorities and constituency on the Hill and constituency in the executive branch. I think the NRO and the Air Force or the U.S. Space Force have different missions. And I like, at least at the moment, the focus on where they operationally need to synchronize, especially to defend for the purpose of defending and securing valuable national assets. I do think there's discussion about whether there are lessons learned and best practices on acquisition that could be there. But I'm more cautious about talking about DoD IC integration than perhaps I was as a younger officer, because I hadn't thought about it, I think, as carefully as I have since. I think a lot of progress is being made now. I do think a lot of that progress is being done sort of below the surface of the water that we're not seeing. And I wouldn't really want to comment on how well it's going today, actually, between General Raymond and the director of the NRO. It's because I'm not qualified to comment on it. I just don't know. I do think the culture of the U.S. Space Force doesn't really exist yet, and the culture of the NRO does. And I think it's the NRO, at least has been viewed as highly mission focused, maybe not quite as many levels of bureaucratic levels of chain of command. very good at acquisition, very good at integrating operations and acquisition. And those are all sort of broad generalizations, I think, of things that are viewed as good and strengths of the NRO, career-long development of people, especially in their civilian workforce.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Space Force could have the same culture in those areas of the NRO that they think are attractive. And so, I think good culture is good culture, but I just would be cautious on the integration between the two, unless we really have thought it through and we had a lot of a common view on the Hill and in the executive branch that it was a good idea.
That's fair. Given your service as Deputy Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, what would you like to see in terms of coordination between the Space Force, Space Command, and U.S. Cyber Command? What are the major opportunities there, and what can reasonably be expected in terms of such cross-domain integration? Your paper touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to draw you out a little bit more on that question.
Sure. In the paper, again, I as an old retired guy, I have to continually remind others and myself that I'm not privy to all the discussions happening today, and so I'm not. So what I have is the ability to read what's been published, and so I do mention in the paper that I think the U.S. Space Force could benefit from a much stronger embracing of cyber capabilities, even though they're a space domain oriented force. I've seen really positive examples. I'll use the Army as an example, clearly a land domain force, but one that recognized several years ago the importance that cyber operations, both offensively and defensive cyber, how important they are to the success of a land-oriented military service. And they've also done a great job of providing cyber capacity to U.S. Cyber Command. And so I make the point that I think the U.S. Space Force should be equally aggressive in thinking about how capabilities in other domains other than space could be actually important to their assigned missions. And so, and certainly you mentioned, Chris, in your question, between the U.S. Space Force and the U.S. Space Command, the new Combatant Command, and U.S. Cyber Command, what are some of the opportunities? I think there are a couple. And again, some of these may be already underway or being discussed, and some of these have some resource implications. But I think the first one is all of the existing military services other than the Space Force were tasked back in 2013 to build and field some ratio of the 133 offensive and defensive cyber teams that are part of U.S. Cyber Command's Cyber Mission Force. They're the tactical arm. It's the tactical cyber arm of our department. But they also, each service that built those teams, their teams have the ability to focus on unique problems associated with their service. So I would recommend that the Space Force work with OSD, the Joint Staff, and Cyber Command to kind of determine what are the eventual Space Force contributions to the Cyber Mission Force, and what are the unique Space Force cyber mission needs, and then begin to think about resourcing towards that, or perhaps taking some of the existing Air Force capacity and applying it towards Space Force unique problems. I do think U.S. Space Command and Cyber Command, and to be honest, probably other combatant commands, are already deep in dialogue about how they will integrate both sort of at the combatant command level for planning and execution of multi-domain operations. Today, that sort of trans-regional warfighting in the chairman's sort of view of global integration means that geographic combatant commands and global combatant commands are really all having to figure out how to integrate in their planning and execution of sort of complex trans-regional ops. I'm sure the commander of Space Command is deep into that, and that the Space Force will just, their components will be tasked to support whatever it is the combatant command is tasked to do, because I think those forces are assigned to U.S. Space Command. So there's a lot of opportunities. I've listed a few of the near-term things that I think would be worthy of working on, but I'm sure there are others and more that are underway.
We have several questions from our attendees today. One is from a gentleman who says, I'm a sailor. What role do you see for incorporating not just members of other services, but also elements of their cultures into the Space Force? What about strategic concepts like those of Mahan and Corbett?
Yeah. Well, as you just mentioned, I mentioned earlier that the strategic concepts, such as those from Mahan, are examples of things that came from not only another service, but came from something many decades ago. I think the U.S. Space Force should welcome diverse thought and experience, from others into its service. But I do have a but. The but is in terms of people that would come in. I think the people that would make up the Space Force ought to be people that are actually going to embrace the new culture and bring their contribution to that culture. What I don't think we should do, I've seen it whether it was standing up ORS or in other areas, is where you bring in so many diverse points of view that they're not actually contributing to the development of a new culture. They're actually being disruptive and actually creating a lot of controversy and opposition towards what the leadership are trying to do. And I'm not saying the person that asked the question would think that way, but I think General Raymond ought to be careful to sort of bring those people, whether they're in the other services or other parts of the Air Force. And I know he's kind of working through different tranches of people that are actually coming into the Space Force formally, and eventually that will include, I believe, from the other services. But I do think it ought to be, we ought to bring people that actually are positioned through experience and others to make a contribution, whether it's bringing a new way of thinking or bringing space expertise in, but not just because somebody wears another uniform, they may not have the right background to make a contribution. So I think it's something that should be handled with care, but should be embraced as a desired attribute.
I have another question from a participant today. 2 questions about the Space Force acquisition community culture. Can you speak to how the culture within Air Force Space Command, SMC, U.S. Space Force acquisition community either casts a shadow or, on the other hand, shines a light on the space warfighting culture? And then secondly, the question is, can General Raymond's desire for a space warfighting culture of risk-taking, speed, and innovation become a reality if the culture of acquisition is risk avoidance, strategy of stable, long-running programs, and following acquisition rules in a very narrow way? So those 2 questions, if you don't mind, Kevin.
Sure. So it's a good question, and I am mindful of the discussion that's going on today about along these lines. But I think back to I think the 2000, probably 4 or 5 time frame when I was asked. You got to remember, I was a space operator, and I was asked to go take command of a new entity called the Space Development and Test Wing inside Space and Missile Systems Center. And also stand up the Joint Operationally Responsive Space Office, which may be a sort of a predecessor of the Space RCO, but I don't think they're exactly the same. But the whole move towards doing that was built upon a criticism of the current Air Force Space Command and the current SMC approach to developing and operating space systems. And that's the group, that's the community that I'd come from. And I certainly would recommend, and for future things, that you might want to define what needs to be done better. But when you stand up a new thing by criticizing everybody associated with the old thing, that's usually generates unneeded controversy. And that certainly happened in the ORS Space Development Test Wing days, and I think it's happening a little bit today, where we're creating friction between those people, like those at SMC that have been operating for decades, and those that are saying they're not doing it correctly, and they're not innovative or speedy or rapid enough. So I do think if you try to be objective about it, you could step back and find lots of examples to where what they do today at SMC isn't what they've done sort of in the legacy side is not exactly whether it's Secretary Mattis was defining in the last National Defense Strategy as sort of a speed of relevance of things that need to happen broadly, or it's almost every speech I've seen of General Raymond in this area is talking about those attributes that you guys mentioned. You mentioned in the question about innovation and speed and risk taking and challenging old paradigms and doing things new, bringing new technology or new commercial practices in. All of those are desirable attributes. I don't hear as much said about the connection of the operator to the development and acquisition community, but that's been powerful in other areas. I think it's important. So I do think General Raymond has the ability to create this new paradigm. I'm hopeful that the reason we haven't seen a lot of detail on the new Space Systems Command, this new field command, is that they're still, they're actually working on creating something brand new, not creating something where it's just built on top of SMC, but maybe it's on something to where the core competencies of Space and Missile Systems Center in the areas where they're really good at and they're very talented remain as a something that's important. But organizations like the Space Development Agency, the Space Rapid Capabilities Office are also embraced and have the ability to stand up and flourish, so that the Space Force actually has sort of this breadth of kind of an ambidextrous set of behaviors that allow us to do very rapid, high risk things, but at the same time, if there's something that maybe is more complicated or very, very critical and can't fail, that maybe there might be a different set of attributes to that. So I don't think it's useful to just throw rocks at all the people that have been doing such a great job at this for a long time. But the reality is we have to do new things and have new ways of doing business. But we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We just need to create a new thing that leverages sort of the raw material and talent that we have in the Space Force.
Right. Another question from a viewer is, when do we know we're at war in space? Are we at war in space today? He mentions that Iran shot down a Global Hawk UAV last year and no one got hurt. Is that considered an act of war? Or how do we think about the question of drawing a line on peace versus wartime in space?
Well, I will tell you that is a great and very, very complicated question. It's one that is asked all the time. I would think I was asked that question either on the Hill or down in the Pentagon or even over in the White House sit room dozens of times during my time as the deputy commander at U.S. Cyber Command. Same type of question, and so I would answer it along a couple of ways. I actually have an element of the paper that focuses on this, and it's really first challenging the notion we have as a country that we have sort of the old phasing construct of how we think about conflict. That we're either in peace or we're in crisis or we're in conventional conflict, war, or we're coming out of a war and going back to peace. The reality, I think, over the past, the past probably decade before we even really understood it, is that our adversaries are at war with us and conducting long-term operations against us every day, but they're doing so in a manner meant to cause us strategic harm in ways that don't escalate into conventional conflict. And they make very often very good choices about things to do to challenge us or to even attack us, but using methods that do not cross, what the question the person asked, the red line to go to conventional war. And so we've seen that significantly in cyber. General Nakasone has, I'll just use as an example, has coined this term a set of cyber attacks that are corrosive, strategically corrosive. They take place below the level of armed conflict, but they're stealing IP, they're stealing personal information, threatening critical infrastructure, undermining democratic institutions like elections, and they're all meant to cause strategic harm over a long period of time. Yet none of them created a red line crossing that sent us into conventional war. And so that's the world we're living in today. And I think there's a lot being talked about publicly about new authorities in cyber, but the reality is our military and our national security apparatus is thinking more and more about competing every day and not just sort of falling into the red line, are we in conventional conflict or not? In the shoot down of the UAV, the Global Hawk that was mentioned, I don't think any of us probably really know all that happened in response to that. What we thought was it was just a simple, they crossed a red line. We're going to go to some lower level of conflict. We're going to strike kinetically, blow up some surface to air missile sites or kill some Iranian folks. I'd be surprised if we just did nothing. But the question is, how did we react when the question was asked, like the person that asked the question by the president or by the SecDef? I think that those are much more sophisticated discussions today. And I think we know we're at war when something happens and it clearly crosses the threshold that we're going to go into armed conflict, which can happen, but more likely today, we're going to be in these more vague areas where I would imagine U.S. Space Command and Space Force forces assigned to it will be asked to do things to compete in this more murky area below the level of armed conflict that exists going forward. So it's a hard question, but it is one that gets asked a lot. And to be honest, it's kind of a trick question. There's usually not a straightforward answer to that. I can remember Senator McCain visiting us at Cyber Command, and he asked the exact same question, and we kind of gave him some of these examples, and he got really angry just because of the lack of clarity in the answer. And to be honest, it's a hard thing to answer with great clarity. So
I'm going to give you another one that
that's my answer.
Well, I'm going to give you another one that's kind of along those lines. Space warfighting culture implies, indeed embraces, the notion of planning for conflict in space, whether through kinetic, cyber, jamming, lasers, EMP, or other means and methods. Clearly, our primary nation-state adversaries, Russia and China, are developing the means to conduct such attack operations and have modified their organizational structures to enable such operations. Do you believe the U.S. is appropriately prepared for conflict in space today? And how would adoption of a space warfighting culture aid in preparing for a conflict in space?
Well, so I believe everything that you said about what is going on in our adversaries is true. I think it's been viewed as true in a bipartisan way by the political leadership of the country, and that is our national security and economy are critically dependent on space capabilities. That the space capabilities and the forces that operate them today aren't built or resilient or able to easily withstand the types of attacks that our adversaries know if they were to accomplish those attacks against our relatively fragile space enterprise, they would have a significant advantage in future conflict, or perhaps ending conflict early on their terms. And our country has said we don't have the right equipment, we don't have the right sets of architectures, we certainly don't have the right organizations or people in place to deal with this and to be ready to deal with it in the future. And I think that's sort of the punchline of why we have a space force. And so so I think, first of all, I start from that perspective, Chris, in answering this question. I do think that today we don't really have, even though we are investing money in Space Force, even before the Space Force stood up a year ago, we were investing money in new capabilities. We were doing all kinds of studies on resilient architectures, and that stayed, been working at a high pace. We've created, the National Space Defense Center in Colorado Springs. There's all kinds of activity trying to get us to the point to where we would be prepared and able to, defend ourselves in this area. But I think you don't create that overnight. You don't even create it in a few years. So I think we're well on our way to doing it. But I don't think the capabilities are in place. I don't think we have the people trained and in place yet to do it to the degree that we need. I don't think we've created the culture that this paper describes. I think we are in the progress of doing that. But I think there's this period of risk, kind of between where we are today versus how severe the threat is today. And every year or every few years that we can build and create all the things that we're talking about gets us to the point where I actually think warfare conflict is much less likely, because I think the benefit of an attack against us gets less every day that we keep hoovering away on the work that we're talking about. So I don't think we're there yet, but I think we're on our way there, and I think we can get there in a better way and more quickly if we can follow through on some of the things that are mentioned in this paper.
Well, Kevin, on behalf of the National Security Space Association, again, we deeply appreciate the time you spent with us today. Deeply appreciate the work you put into this very insightful paper. As I mentioned before, I think it should be required reading across the Space Force. I know you'll get a lot of feedback. You're already getting feedback on the paper. And so congratulations on stimulating the debate, a much needed debate in this case. So thank you very much for doing that. Let me also say thank you to our viewers today. We greatly appreciate your time and interest. And until the next NSSA Space Time event, we wish you a wonderful day, and everyone stay healthy, please. So thank you very much. And out here, thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everybody. Take care.